I want to share with you a few verses that have really challenged myself over the last, I guess since the start of August. I read these verses at the beginning of August, and they spoke to me so profoundly. I've been thinking about them again and again and again, almost on a, not quite a daily basis, but certainly very regularly. They're from Matthew 13. Jesus was a brilliant storyteller. We all know that one of his key ways of communicating was through stories. We call them parables. And Jesus' parables were not just brilliant and gripping and absorbing stories that people could identify with and understand. They also contained real spiritual meaning. And there's a set of parables in Matthew 13 that have really struck a chord with me, as I said, over recent weeks. And we refer to them as the parables of the kingdom. Now, we, of course, live in the United Kingdom, which at this stage in our history is somewhat controversial. When we talk about Jesus' kingdom, that was central to Jesus' teaching, but not the kind of kingdom that we normally expect or think about. Since King Charles' investiture, controversy, as I said, has raised its ugly head. And almost wherever King Charles goes, if you could go to the next slide, please, there seem to be protesters, not very many of them, but nevertheless protesters, holding up these placards saying, "Not my king." In other words, these people, while they recognize they live in the United Kingdom, which is a constitutional monarchy, they don't like the idea of a king ruling over them, whatever that means. They're not so keen on it, and therefore they protest. But the reality is that whether they like it or not, we do live in the United Kingdom. That's simply a fact of life. I grew up initially in Ethiopia, which was also a monarchy. It was the Emperor Haile Selassie. He was our Nugus, or king in Ethiopia. And whether you liked him or not, whether you liked the system or not, that's where you live, and therefore you're living in a kingdom. You have no choice of the matter. But when Jesus talked about the kingdom, he was referring to it in quite a different way. Yes, being part of God's kingdom is to allow Jesus to be the king of your life. He rules over us. But it's an entirely voluntary thing. God never forces people to believe in him. Jesus never compelled people to believe in him. But he did say, "This is what I stand for, and if you want to come under my authority, come under my rule and follow me, then you as an individual will join my kingdom because I will rule in your life." And that was Jesus' kingdom. And Matthew 13 is interesting because you've got a whole series of parables here that discuss what it means to be part of Jesus' kingdom. Now, the most famous of these is one we're not going to deal with at all. It's the parable of the sower. And I'm sure you've all read or heard that parable before. Actually, in the Glow Centre, where I work, we've got a big stained glass window because our centre used to be a Church of Scotland. And the stained glass window is of the sower. And the sower goes out to sow. And in that particular parable, at the beginning of Matthew 13, Jesus tells the story of the sower who's sowing seed in 4 different types of ground. And 3 of them not very hospitable ground for that seed. And it ends up not growing. But the 4th ground, that represents the kind of people who say, "Yeah, I want to follow Jesus. I want him to rule in my life. I want him to make a difference to my everyday." And that's the good soil that falls on. Now, that's the famous parable from Matthew 13. But we're going to look at 2 parables which aren't so famous, and they're tiny parables, actually, which is why maybe they're not very famous. People don't think much of them because they're so short. But they are a sequel to the parable of the sower. They're the follow-on. And they look at what should happen, what does happen in our lives when we say, "I will surrender my life to King Jesus." So here's the sequel. We'll start with verse 31. The parable of the mustard seed in Matthew 13. He told them another parable. "The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it's the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds come and perch in its branches." Well, that was quick, wasn't it? Very short parable. Of course, Jesus' parables were taken from everyday life. And mustard, which I'm sure you've all seen mustard seeds. I'm sure you've all eaten mustard. We put it on our roast beef or whatever. It was incredibly common in Jesus' day because then it was also used to flavor food. And it was so common that at most Jewish families, if they had a little garden or an allotment, they would almost certainly grow mustard there. And in fact, it grew wild as well. So you walk out in the wilderness, you'll see mustard trees out there or shrubs, because it was extremely common. And Jesus said this mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds. Botanically speaking, strictly speaking, that isn't the case. You can sometimes find smaller seeds than mustard seeds, but not in Palestine. Of all the stuff that would typically grow in Palestine, it was really very small. If you go to the next slide, I'll show you a picture of mustard seeds. That's how small it is. Look at your thumb and index finger, because that's a thumb and an index finger of an average person. Just look at yours for a second and imagine that wee dot. That's a mustard seed. And it was so small that people would use it as a unit of measurement. If you're wanting to describe something that's absolutely tiny, like an Irish person's brain, or Scotland's chance of winning the Rugby World Cup, or, sorry, I shouldn't have said that, particularly as my country is playing your country next. Anyway, you would say it's as small as a mustard seed, and people would know what you're talking about because it's tiny. And Jesus makes a big point of talking about its smallness. Now, why is that? Well, I don't know how many avid gardeners we have here. My wife and I would say, are avid but unsuccessful gardeners. So our current house is all stone, and we've got a few pots there. But I get why people love gardening. It's magical. It's brilliant. And I had that wow experience recently because at the start of the summer, we planted some wee seeds in one of our big flower pots. And then, of course, it began to rain, and it kept raining for all of June, all of July, most of August. And finally, the rain stopped. So Debbie and I went out to the garden to relax on the rare sunny day that we had in August. And as we sat there on our chairs relaxing, I turned to one of these flower pots, and it was blooming with color. It's fabulous. And that's the miracle of gardening. It's wonderful. You take those tiny seeds, you put them in that soil. They don't look very promising. And then suddenly they begin to sprout. They germinate. And if you go to the next slide, that picture of plants emerging from the soil, it's incredible, isn't it? It's beautiful. And Jews in the first century would understand that feeling because many folk, even city dwellers, would grow their own food, at least to some extent. So you're used to seeing plants and you know what seeds do and all the rest of it. And you can just imagine the scene where Jesus is illustrating with this mustard seed, a Jewish dad taking his children down to the allotment, and he says to the kids, look, we're going to grow something wonderful here. We're going to grow a plant. It's called a mustard plant, and it's going to get really, really big. And Jesus describes the mustard plant as the largest of all garden plants. Again, botanically speaking, might not be accurate globally, but in Palestine it just about is. It's not actually a tree, it's a shrub, but it's huge. And this dad would say to his kids, look at those seeds, we're going to grow something huge here, and they'd say, from that? There's no way. They're tiny. How can that ever grow into anything that's big or significant? But it does. Especially in good growing contexts. And the ideal context for mustard to grow in is sandy soil, hot temperatures, lots of sunshine, fairly dry, which just about sums up Palestine, doesn't it? It's the best place to grow mustard. And if you go to the next picture, that's what a mustard plant looks like. Now, it's not a tree. It's not a tree. Jesus talked about branches so wide that birds can perch in its branches. It's not a tree, it's a shrub. But you could easily think it's a tree because it grows so massive. It can grow to 20 or 30 feet high, and the branches typically spread out to make the most of the sunlight. So you have this massive canopy. And out in the desert, when you want some shade, and I've seen this because I grew up in Ethiopia, you go to a mustard plant to get shade. Because big branches will cover you and give you shade from the piercing sunlight. And birds do come and they make their nests there. It's amazing. Now, of course, this is a parable, which means that there's meant to be some kind of spiritual meaning here. So what is Jesus talking about? Well, bear in mind, this is the sequel. Parable of the sower. The seed falls on good ground, people who want to follow Jesus. And by the way, if you're here for the first time, that's really what a Christian is. I've heard lots of definitions of what a Christian is, but a Christian is really somebody who wants to follow Jesus, who wants Jesus to be in charge of their lives, who wants to live like him, to obey him, to allow him to guide their lives. That's what a Christian is. They're following Jesus. And when we allow Jesus to reign in our lives, something needs to happen. And in the sequel, this parable of the mustard seed, Jesus said, well, what needs to happen is change, growth, and it needs to be evident. When you first become a Christian, and I can remember the day I became a Christian, it was the very last day of the year 1982. I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it was a long, long time ago. And I know exactly how I felt when I became a Christian. I wasn't really sure what I was doing. I didn't really understand much about Christianity. I'd never read the Bible. I'd been forced to pray by my parents, but never meant anything by it. I wasn't even sure that God existed back then. And then God began to speak to me very powerfully through other young people. I was 18 years of age. And I decided to give my life to Jesus, and I didn't know what would happen next. I mean, if I say this prayer, and I heard people talk about the sinner's prayer. What's the sinner's prayer? And the guy who helped me become a Christian just said, just pray whatever's in your heart. And I said, well, I've never done this prayer. I don't know what to do. He said, just tell God what you think. So I just said, God, I'm lost. I'm desperate. Please help me. And that's all I said. When you've never prayed before, you don't know what to say. But I was absolutely sincere. I wanted God to make a difference in my life. I wanted forgiveness. I wanted that guilt which was destroying my life to be taken away, because I felt guilty daily about things I'd been doing. And I just knew I needed change. And my life was over. It was finished. It was drudgery unless I experienced change. And so in desperation, I called out to God, and I had no idea what I was doing. All I knew was, I need Jesus. And following Jesus can be as simple as that. Just like that tiny seed, it seems so inconsequential. And when I went home and told my parents that I'd begun to follow Jesus, they were Christians. I'm not sure they entirely believed me. My dad just kind of said, oh, that's good. And I'm not sure he believed me. He was already on Valium because he couldn't cope with my behavior as a delinquent 18-year-old. And then my mother told my headmaster of the school I'd been expelled from. And he said, well, if you told me that Stephen was in prison, I'd find that more believable. And he didn't believe her either. Such a small start. But you see, it doesn't remain that way. People become Christians because they need Jesus to make a difference in their lives, and they don't stay the way they are. By definition, being a Christian means you change. And Jesus says here in this parable, that change has to be evident, palpable, so obvious to see, as different as that seed becoming something like that. So can I ask you, if you are a Christian, and most of you, I presume, are. I wondered if have folk noticed the difference? Think back to people you knew before you became a Christian, maybe neighbours or friends or folk at school with you or your own family. I wonder, have they seen a real change in your life? Because if they haven't, something has gone wrong or is going wrong. Because in this sequel, Jesus is saying that to become a follower of his, to come into God's kingdom, to allow Jesus to reign in our lives involves change. And if that change is not evident, then maybe you're not really a royalist at all. You're a Republican and you're resisting the difference that King Jesus wants to make in your life. And that should be a challenge. Now, having given us that parable, he then goes on to another sequel, verse 33. Parable of the yeast. Let me read this parable to you. Verse 33, he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour until it worked all through the dough. And that's it. And you're kind of thinking, well, is that it? I mean, for goodness sake, if you're going to tell us a story, tell us a decent one. That's a bit quick. But think about it for a second. I don't know how many of you like baking. I used to love, when my kids were small, doing baking with them. And I love the smell of fresh baked bread. I cannot walk past a bakery if there's fresh baked bread and not buy some. I just love it. And I used to make these loaves of bread with my kids, which I could have killed them with, actually. They were so heavy. I never got the light stuff. I mean, it tasted okay, but now that I'm getting elderly and my teeth are becoming loose, I wouldn't eat my bread any longer because it could do me, my teeth, serious damage. But it smelled good and tasted okay. But the thing I loved about the bread was, first of all, the therapy, kneading dough. I mean, you can't hit your kids these days. I say that jokingly, but I never did. But when you're kneading dough, it's you work out all your tension, and you're thumping the dough, and you're thinking, good job I don't play football any longer. I would be doing that on the football pitch. At least I can work out my aggression on this dough. And it's so therapeutic working through that. And then you sprinkle in some yeast from a tiny silver foil package. And I'd say to the kids, just look at that. And they say, what am I looking at? You're looking at dough with yeast in it. Yeah, well, why am I looking at that? I said, how big is it? Well, it's not very big, it's tiny. Okay. Get me a big bowl. Why a big bowl? No, just get me a big bowl. So get me a big bowl. Let's put this tiny wee bit of dough in this big bowl. But Dad, why are you using a big bowl? Well, you'll see. Now get me a towel. And wet it with warm water, and then let's put it over the bowl. Fine. Why are you using a towel? Well, just go with me on this. So we'd cover the bowl with a towel, and every few minutes I'd walk back into the kitchen with the kids, and they'd be saying, what's happening? And then they'd suddenly see a bulge in the towel. Now, some of you who've made bread will know this. And it bulges more and more. And my kids were desperate. I've been blessed with 3 curious children. They're all now grown up and much bigger than me. But it was so wonderful to have curious kids. I loved it. And they were desperate to look under the towel. I said, no, don't look yet. And eventually, after about 2 hours, I'd say, okay, let's remove the towel. And they would charge into the kitchen. I miss being a parent, by the way. I love these days. Go to the next picture. And they'd pull back the towel, and there's this, and I could actually hear my kids going, because that tiny piece of dough had become huge. Now, here's the thing that messes with your mind a wee bit. Yeast doesn't grow. It doesn't. Well, how come that's become like that? Well, you see, although yeast doesn't grow, it permeates everything. Permeates everything. Jesus was a brilliant teacher. He understood these things profoundly. and what they could teach us. Every single molecule of that tiny batch of dough has been permeated and impacted by the yeast. And because of it, you've got this amazing development. What is Jesus saying here? Well, in the first sequel, the mustard seed, he's saying that if you become a follower of Jesus, if you surrender your life to him, there has to be change. What he's saying through this parable is similar but different. He's saying that change needs to impact and affect every aspect of your life. Now think about that. I often take time as a Christian to analyze my life. And so often my Christian life can be a pick and mix mentality. You know the way you go into a shop and you decide to do pick and mix with the sweeties because there's some you like, some you don't like. And when my wife buys American hard gums or jelly beans, I always get the dark ones out, and I leave the yellow ones for some reason. I don't know why, but I leave the yellow ones. All the black ones I eat. Pick and mix. And I can be like that with my Christian life. Because there are some areas of my life where I'm quite happy for Jesus to become king and to rule and to change. Other areas I don't really want him to touch because it's too hard. It's too costly. And I don't think I'm alone in that. But if we are genuinely to surrender to Jesus, then we have to surrender all of our lives to him, not compartmentalize. And that means that this same change that we need to see taking place in our lives has to impact every area, absolutely every area. Think of our attitudes, for example. We can easily have wrong attitudes, which nobody else can see, but of course God sees them. I find it so easy to be selfish. So easy to be jealous, greedy, self-obsessed. So easy to be a negative person, to be a complaining person, to see all the bad and not see the good, to be critical, to be full of bitterness. And what about how our attitudes affect our tongue? I don't know about you, but for me, the most difficult thing I find to control is my tongue. I've never mastered it. And I always regret things that I've said. Always, always. And I've been a Christian, as I've already told you, since 1982. And I know what my tongue used to be like before then. It was awful. It was awful. I would be ashamed to hear people, to know that people had heard me speak before I became a Christian. Ashamed of the things I said in the language that I use. And things have changed, but not enough. Not enough. I still say things I am profoundly ashamed of. Criticizing other people. Not being entirely accurate or honest with the truth. We call it a wee white lie, but what is a wee white lie? It's actually a lie. And just being mean with what I say. I think, again, it's part of being Irish. I kid you not. We as Irish people have a propensity for cruelty in our humor. We really are cruel. And yeah, it's only a joke, but not if somebody's been hurt by it. That's not a joke. And I still say it. Jesus needs to be Lord there. And what about my thought life? I was speaking to a pastor just a week ago. I met up with him. And we met in a mutual venue about an hour away from each other's house because we live quite far apart. And we just met up so I could talk to him about some of the challenges he's facing. He's really struggling. And one of his struggles is with some key Christians in his church who he can no longer use in his church because of some of their darker habits. And with one of them, the key issue is this thing here, and I have one of these, and it's pornography. It's somebody who he revered as a key Christian in his church, who he wanted to put into leadership. And he's now having to deal with a pastoral issue because, so we just say the police have wanted to look at his phone. One of the biggest challenges that both men and women face is pornography. And because it's so easy to access on a device like this. Actually, my wife and I, we often swap our phones. And we do deliberately. And she knows my PIN number. She also knows the PIN number of my laptop. And we do that deliberately. Why? Because we want to hold each other accountable. Because we want Jesus to be Lord of our thought life. I don't want to think any thoughts or see anything that would embarrass Jesus, because he's king of my life. And then think about our actions. We can so often be lazy or inconsistent or unreliable. We were doing a collection at the football yesterday for our food bank. Motherwell Celtic, and I asked to go to the Celtic end because with my Irish accent, I go down well with the crowd who come over for the Celtic games. And when I asked for funding, they gave me money, and lots of it, which is wonderful for our food bank. And I had a friend who I wanted to come and help, and he said, I'll be there to help you. And he wasn't. Being unreliable, being inconsistent. Is that the kind of life that Jesus wants for us? You see, the yeast permeates every area. And this is a profound challenge for me as a Christian. Does Jesus really rule my life? And I've been asking myself that question all summer long, ever since the start of August when I read these verses. Does he really rule my life? And I thought about it in this way. Can you imagine if I invited you to come and stay with me in Muirhill? You wouldn't want to. You live in a lovely place like Troon. Muirhill's a bit of a dump, but just imagine that Muirhill became nice, and I invited you to come and stay with me. And you walked in my front door into my living room, and I said, great to have you here. You are so welcome. And you can use our tiny toilet downstairs, but don't go upstairs. I know the bedrooms are up there and the proper bathrooms up there. Don't go upstairs. You can't use the staircase. And don't go to the kitchen. Don't want you muddy boots in my kitchen. To leave my kitchen alone. But you can stay here in the living room, and you can use my downstairs toilet, and that's it. But you're very welcome. Lovely to have you. How at home would you feel with me? And if you're actually coming to stay with me permanently, how easy would that be? Not very. So often when we as Christians invite Jesus and invite his Holy Spirit who comes to reside within us to take up residence in our lives, we do that compartmentalization. You're allowed here and here, but you're not allowed there. I don't want to change that aspect of my life. If Jesus isn't Lord of all, he is not Lord at all. Not at all. And I find that deeply, deeply challenging. And I've been really challenged just about my own life. I have been a Christian since 1982. Who's noticed? And I have claimed that Jesus is my King. I've preached about him. I've talked to others about him. I've encouraged other people to follow Jesus as well, and in some cases they have. I wonder how thoroughly he rules in my life. I find that a profound, profound challenge. And I'm actually struggling to know what's the next area I need to really surrender to him, because I haven't done so yet. But this kingdom is a voluntary one. He won't force himself. into other areas of your life. You as a Christian need to be willing to say, Jesus, take this area and please transform me. And if you're not a Christian, he won't force you to follow him. You need to be willing to say, as I did back in 1982, Jesus, I need a change of life. Please come in and rule in me. And if you do, that changes everything. Please go to the very last slide. As I thought about this, I thought about a wonderful thing that Jesus said in John's Gospel. I am the door. By me, if anyone enters in, they will be saved. And I thought about that a lot also since August, the start of August, because yes, I'm a Christian in that back in 1982, my sins were forgiven. But I'm being saved every day from myself. From myself. From all the stuff that I would do, from the thoughts I would think, from the way I would speak, from the person I would be if I hadn't surrendered to Jesus back in 1982. Every day, Jesus is saving me from myself. And I need to enthusiastically reflect back on that door and say, I want to use this doorway and to stay on the right side of this door every day of my life. I need that. Because I need Jesus to continually transform me every day. That ongoing process. So I love these stories. They are so powerful, so meaningful. And my prayer for me and for all of you is that we will discover the wonder every day of the kingdom having full reign in our lives and making life good because King Jesus reigns.